Hello, lichen and mushroom dyers. This video will cover my yarn dyeing process using the lichen Parmatrema austrosonense. I used Karen Casselman's book Lichen Dyes as guidance for making my ammonia fermentation dye vats, and as a friendly reminder, we should only be collecting windfall lichens as they can take years to grow on their substrates. I have my dye station set up, so let's get into it. I use a mesh strainer bag to strain the lichen out. I have table salt for light fastness. I have my yarn that's unmordanted but pre-soaking in water. Let's first strain out this lichen vat through the strainer into the pot. I tie up the top of the mesh bag once all the lichen is out of my dye vat, and I toss it into the dye bath to process with my fiber. Then I add about a half cup of table salt and mix it around as best I can. Once the dye bath is warming up, the salt will dissolve all of the way. But for the meantime, it's kind of just grainy in the bottom of the dye pot, and that's going to be okay. I add enough water to fill the dye pot about halfway. I turn on my hot plate to a pretty low setting. I had used my yarn soaking water to fill my dye pot, so here's my still wet yarn, and into the dye bath we go. This is one of my favorite parts of processing yarn, is when you first dunk the yarn into your dye bath and you can see that super vibrant purple color is already starting to show up. I try to make sure that I'm submerging the yarn equally and so that the color will be as even as possible. Right away, I can see that the yarn is already picking up pigment, so I'm super excited. Next up, I'm going to check the pH by ripping off a strip of tape and dipping it into the dye bath. I'm looking for somewhere between 7 and 9, and it looks like it's right between 8 and 9, so I'm pretty happy with where I'm at. A dye bath that is too basic will hurt your yarn. After 30 minutes, I give a gentle stir and check the temperature. After 30 more minutes, we've hit about 170, and I don't want to pass 180 degrees. So I turned my pot down a little, put the lid on, and set my timer to begin processing the yarn for an hour. After an hour at 160 degrees, I'll turn the burner off and let it sit overnight until it's cool. The next day, I'll turn on the burner, bring my pot back up to 160, and then turn it off immediately and let it cool overnight again. After the yarn is cool, I toss it in an old plastic bag and let it sit another 12 to 24 hours, or whenever it's convenient for me to rinse it. I will say at this point the yarn does smell horrific. It's like rotten garbage and fish, but it does thankfully rinse out. It's scary at first to see color come out of the yarn as you rinse it, but it's only the excess. A lot of the dye does stay in the yarn, and so I usually rinse until all of my water is running clear and my yarn no longer smells like garbage. These dyes are not happy in direct sun, so I try to dry outside at night only and then bring them inside during the day. This purple is so great. I'm so excited to see it when it's totally dry. Now I'm going to use the same dye bath as an exhaust to dye 2 mini skeins. I'm going to check the pH again because it can change as a result of heat and yarn processing. It still looks like 8 though, so we're in good shape. I'm going to add my pre-soaked, pre-scoured, but unmordanted yarn to my exhaust bath. I can already tell that my dye bath isn't as strong as my last round, but I'm processing about half as much fiber, so I think I'll still get pretty good results. I'm going to follow all of the same dye procedures as my first round. So I'll bring my yarn up as close to 180 as I can, and then bring it down to 160 degrees and process for an hour. This will be on day 1. Then I'll let it cool, and the next morning I'll bring it back up to 160 degrees and turn it off immediately. After it's totally cool, it's back in the bag for 12 hours. This yarn I'm rinsing is actually my second exhaust batch, so it should come out the lightest of my 3 batches of dyed yarn. Again, I'm rinsing until the water is clear and I don't see any more particulate coming out in the rinse. It still smells bad, but that'll go away as I rinse and dry the yarn. This purple is definitely the lightest of my 3 batches, but I'm very pleased with the results. Here's a picture of my indoor drying setup. I put a plastic tray and towel on the ground beneath the yarn to catch the drips. And here are my 3 dried hanks. You can really see the variation in color strength from right to left. My initial batch had 100 grams, and each exhaust had 50 grams. I hope this was informational and inspires you to get out and do some salvage botany of your own. Happy dyeing!